In the quiet classroom of Peartree Junior School in Stevenage, a math teacher's red pen marked more than just incorrect answers. Mrs. Verity Clark's words to a 13-year-old Lewis Hamilton, "Boys from Stevenage don't become Formula One drivers," were meant to guide him toward practical goals. She couldn't have known that those dismissive words would fuel a determination that would carry him to 7 world championships and knighthood. 23 years later, as Mrs. Clark stands in the Mercedes garage wearing his number 44, she finally understands what that young boy knew all along. Some equations transcend mathematics, like the sum of dreams and determination equaling the infinite possibilities of a human spirit. Mrs. Verity Clark sighed as she marked the last math test in the stack. Outside her classroom window at Peartree Junior School, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the playground in Stevenage. The clock on the wall showed 4:15 p.m. Most teachers had gone home, but Mrs. Clark always stayed late on Fridays to finish her grading. "Oh, Lewis," she whispered, shaking her head as she put a big red X on yet another wrong answer. Lewis Hamilton, age 13, had failed another math test. This was his 3rd failed test this term. Mrs. Clark rubbed her tired eyes and took a sip of cold tea. She had been teaching math for 20 years at schools across Hertfordshire. In that time, she had seen students who would become doctors, lawyers, and business owners. She could spot talent early, and she could spot dreams that were too big. Lewis Hamilton sat in the back of her class, always drawing race cars instead of solving equations. His notebook was full of sketches rather than numbers. When she called on him, his answers were often wrong or he wasn't paying attention at all. "Dreaming of Formula One?" Mrs. Clark muttered, writing a large 42% at the top of his paper in red ink. "That boy needs to wake up." She had heard about Lewis's karting. Many teachers talked about it in the staff room. Lewis had started racing go-karts at age 8. Now at 13, he was winning races across the country. His father, Anthony, worked 3 jobs to pay for it all. Mrs. Clark circled a particularly messy calculation on Lewis's paper. In the margin, she wrote, "See me after class on Monday." It was time for a serious talk. Lewis needed to focus on realistic goals, not fairy tales about becoming a Formula One driver. Only 20 drivers in the whole world made it to Formula One, and none of them came from council estates in Stevenage. Mrs. Clark packed the tests into her bag and looked at the classroom walls. Posters of famous mathematicians hung next to student work. One chart showed which students had improved the most this term. Lewis's name was near the bottom. On Monday morning, Mrs. Clark arrived early to prepare for her classes. The school hallways were quiet except for the distant sound of the caretaker's vacuum. She took out her lesson plans, and Lewis's failed test, placing it on her desk where she could see it. The day moved slowly. First period, second period, lunch duty in the cafeteria. Finally, last period arrived. Year 8 Math with Lewis's class. "Turn to page 43 in your textbooks," Mrs. Clark instructed. "Today, we're continuing with fractions." A chorus of groans filled the room. Mrs. Clark scanned the students and found Lewis in his usual spot in the back row. He wasn't even looking at his textbook. Instead, his head was bent over something on his desk. "Lewis," Mrs. Clark called sharply, "what are you working on that's more important than fractions?" 28 heads turned to look at Lewis, who quickly covered his paper with his hand. "Nothing, Mrs. Clark," he said softly. "Bring it here, please," she said, holding out her hand. Lewis walked slowly to the front of the class, his shoulders slumped. He handed her a drawing of a race car, detailed down to the tiny sponsor logos and aerodynamic parts. Mrs. Clark held up the drawing. "This is why Lewis is failing math," she announced to the class. "Because he's busy being an artist during lessons." Some students laughed. Lewis stared at his shoes, his cheeks burning red. "You can have this back after class," Mrs. Clark said, placing the drawing on her desk. "And don't forget, I need to speak with you after the bell." As she taught the lesson on fractions, Mrs. Clark noticed Lewis wasn't taking notes. He stared out the window, his mind clearly elsewhere. When the final bell rang, students rushed to pack their bags and leave for the weekend. Lewis moved slowly, putting his unused math book into his backpack. "Lewis, please come to my desk," Mrs. Clark called over the noise. The classroom emptied until only Lewis and Mrs. Clark remained. He stood nervously in front of her desk, shifting his weight from one foot to another. Mrs. Clark handed him his test paper with the big red 42% at the top. "This is your third failed test this term," she said. "What do you have to say about that?" Lewis looked at the paper. "I'll try harder next time, Mrs. Clark." "That's what you said last time," she replied. "Lewis, I've asked to speak with you because I'm concerned about your future." Mrs. Clark stood up and walked to the window. Outside, students were leaving school, laughing and pushing each other playfully. "I know about your karting," she continued. "The whole school knows. But Lewis, you need to be practical. Racing is for people with money and connections. You need to focus on subjects that will give you a real future." Lewis's eyes widened. "But, Mrs. Clark, I'm good at racing. Really good. My dad says I could be the best one day." Mrs. Clark sighed. "Parents always think their children are special, Lewis. But the reality is that 1 in a million make it to Formula One. And I've never seen one from Stevenage." She handed him back his drawing of the race car. "Your art skills are quite good. Perhaps you could think about a career in design. But for that, you'll still need math." Lewis took the drawing, carefully folding it and putting it in his pocket. "I am going to be a Formula One driver, Mrs. Clark. I know it's hard, but I'm going to do it." Mrs. Clark shook her head. "Lewis, I've taught for 20 years. I've seen thousands of students come through my classroom. I know which ones will succeed in life. The ones who focus, who work hard at subjects that matter." She tapped his failed test. "This tells me you're not ready to face reality." "Can I go now?" Lewis asked quietly. Mrs. Clark nodded. "Yes, but please think about what I've said. For your homework, I want you to redo these problems." She circled 5 questions on his test. "On Monday, I expect correct answers." Lewis walked slowly to the door, his shoulders hunched. Mrs. Clark almost called him back, feeling she'd been too harsh. But no, he needed to hear the truth. Dreams were fine for children, but at 13, it was time to start thinking sensibly. As the door closed behind Lewis, Mrs. Clark returned to her desk and began preparing Monday's lesson. Outside, Lewis walked alone across the empty playground, wiping tears from his eyes with the back of his hand. He didn't tell his father about the meeting that night. Instead, he took out his notebook and wrote 44 on the cover, his lucky cart number. Underneath, he added the words, "I'll prove her wrong." The weekend passed too quickly. Lewis spent Saturday at the Rye House kart track in Hoddesdon, practicing for next week's race. His dad stood by the fence with a stopwatch, calling out his lap times. Lewis pushed harder with each lap, picturing Mrs. Clark's face instead of the apex of each corner. Sunday evening came, and Lewis sat at the kitchen table trying to redo the math problems Mrs. Clark had assigned. His little brother, Nicholas, played, with toy cars on the floor nearby. "You've been staring at the same problem for 20 minutes, Anthony Hamilton said, looking over his son's shoulder. "What's going on?" Lewis shrugged. "Just don't get it." Anthony pulled up a chair. Which one? He pointed to a fraction problem. This isn't so bad. Look, if you have 3/4 of something and… Dad, Louis interrupted. Do you think I'll really make it to Formula One? Anthony set down his coffee mug and studied his son's face. Where's this coming from? Louis hesitated. My math teacher says I won't. Says I need to focus on school instead of racing. Says kids from Stevenage don't become F1 drivers. Anthony's jaw tightened. Your teacher said that? To your face? Louis nodded, looking down at his math homework. Anthony took a deep breath. Let me tell you something, Louis. People have been telling me what I can't do my whole life. Told me I couldn't raise 2 boys on my own. Told me I couldn't work 3 jobs and still be a good father. He placed his hand on Louis's shoulder. But here we are. But what if she's right? Louis asked quietly. What if I'm wasting my time? Look at me, Anthony said firmly. Are you winning races? Yes. Are you the fastest kid out there most weekends? Louis nodded. Then that's your answer. You have a gift, son. But gifts aren't enough. You need to work harder than everyone else. And you need to ignore people who say you can't do something. Louis smiled for the first time since Friday. That's what I'll do. Good, Anthony said. Now, let's sort out these fractions, then bed. You've got school tomorrow. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. Louis walked into Peartree Junior School with his completed math homework in his backpack. He'd stayed up late getting the problems right, with his dad's help. The day dragged until math class. When Louis walked in, Mrs. Clark was writing equations on the chalkboard. Homework on my desk, she announced without turning around. Louis placed his paper on the stack with the others. During class, he tried to pay attention, taking notes and raising his hand twice to answer questions. Mrs. Clark seemed surprised when his answers were correct. After class, he approached her desk. I finished the problems you gave me, he said. Mrs. Clark nodded. Yes, I saw. Much better work, Louis. Louis took a deep breath. Mrs. Clark, I want you to know something. I am going to be a Formula One driver someday. Mrs. Clark set down her chalk and sighed. Louis, that's not what… I know what you said, Louis continued. But I need to tell you that I won't give up. I'll work hard at math, too, but I won't stop racing. Mrs. Clark studied him for a moment. She saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. A quiet determination beyond his years. Louis, I just want what's best for you, she said, her voice softer than on Friday. The odds are so against you. Do you understand that? 1 in millions. I understand, Louis said. But what if I'm that one? Mrs. Clark shook her head. Even. If you have talent, racing takes money. Lots of money, more than most families have. My dad works 3 jobs, Louis said proudly. And I just got signed by the Zip Young Guns kart team. They help with costs. Mrs. Clark raised her eyebrows. Is that so? Louis nodded eagerly. And McLaren has a program for young drivers. That's my goal next. If I keep winning, they might notice me. McLaren? The Formula One team? Mrs. Clark asked skeptically. Yes, ma'am. They help some young drivers move up through the racing levels. Mrs. Clark leaned back in her chair. For a moment, she considered that perhaps she had been too harsh. But no, it was still 1,000,000 to 1 shot. Better he understand that now than be disappointed later. Louis, I appreciate your determination, and I'm pleased you completed the math problems correctly. But I still think you need to be practical about your future. She pulled out his recent test paper with the red marks. This shows me that you're not focusing enough on school. Louis stared at the failing grade, his earlier confidence fading. I know some boys who went into racing, Mrs. Clark continued. Local stock cars, that sort of thing. They all needed regular jobs, too. One became a mechanic, another works at the supermarket. There's no shame in that. Lewis felt tears threatening again, but blinked them back. "I need to get to my next class," he said. "Yes, off you go," Mrs. Clark replied. "And Lewis, please, try to pay attention in class. Drawing race cars won't help you pass your exams." Lewis walked slowly out of the classroom. In the hallway, he pulled his notebook from his backpack and looked at the number 44 he had written. His lucky number. The number painted on his cart when he won his first championship. Something hardened inside him. Not anger exactly, but resolve. He would show her. He would show everyone. That evening, Lewis sat with his dad watching Formula One highlights on TV. Michael Schumacher won again in his red Ferrari. "That's going to be me someday," Lewis said, pointing at the screen. Anthony nodded. "I believe you, son. But Mrs. Clark is right about one thing. You do need to keep up with your schoolwork." Lewis groaned. "I made a deal with your school," Anthony continued. "They let you miss Fridays for racing as long as your grades stay decent. If you start failing classes, that deal is off." "I hate math," Lewis muttered. "Maybe so, but you'll need it," Anthony said. "Race engineers use math all the time. Calculating fuel loads, tire wear, race strategy." Lewis hadn't thought of that. "Really?" "Really. So how about this? For every hour you practice in the cart, you spend an hour on schoolwork. Deal?" Lewis considered this. Deal. For the next few weeks, Lewis kept his promise. He still struggled in Mrs. Clark's class, but his grades improved slightly. He stopped drawing during lessons, though his notebooks at home were still filled with car designs and racing lines. Mrs. Clark noticed the change, but remained doubtful. She'd seen talented children before, whose dreams faded with reality. Lewis. Hamilton, she believed, would eventually face the same disappointment. She had taught for 20 years and knew which students would succeed, or at least she thought she did. By 2001, Mrs. Verity Clark had moved to teach at a different school in Hartford. Peartree Junior School was now 3 years in her past. She had a new classroom, new students, and new math problems to solve. Life moved on, as it always did. One morning in June, Mrs. Clark sat in the staff room drinking tea and flipping through the local newspaper. A small article in the sports section caught her eye. The headline read, "Local boy signs with McLaren Young Driver Program." Her teacup froze halfway to her lips as she saw the name. Lewis Hamilton, age 16. "Well, I'll be," she whispered. The teacher article was short, just a few paragraphs about a teenager from Stevenage being signed by the McLaren Formula One team as part of their development program. There was a small photo of a young black boy shaking hands with Ron Dennis, the McLaren team boss. Mrs. Clark recognized Lewis immediately, though he looked more grown up now. She read the article twice, learning that Lewis had won multiple karting championships and was now moving up to single-seater race cars. "Something interesting?" asked Mr. Walters, the geography teacher, sitting down across from her. Mrs. Clark folded the newspaper quickly. "No, just local news." She didn't want to explain how she had told this boy he would never make it. That his dreams were unrealistic. She carefully tore out the article when no one was looking and tucked it into her purse. That evening at home, Mrs. Clark pulled out the article again. She found a folder in her desk drawer and placed the clipping inside. Then she closed the drawer, telling herself it was just curiosity. After all, Lewis still had a long way to go to reach Formula One. Many young drivers showed promise, but never made it to the top. Meanwhile, Lewis Hamilton was living his dream, though the path was far from easy. After leaving Peartree Junior School, he had continued winning in karts, becoming European champion. Now he was starting in Formula Renault, his first step in real race cars. The transition wasn't smooth. Some other drivers and their parents looked at Lewis differently. He was often the only black driver at the track. Comments were made, sometimes to his face, sometimes behind his back. "You don't belong here," one father told him at a race in Ivudi, Italy. "Maybe stick to basketball," another boy said during driver briefing. Lewis told his dad about some of it, but not all. Anthony would get angry, protective of his son. Lewis learned to keep his feelings inside and let his driving do the hard talking. On track, no one could deny his speed. Money was still tight for the Hamiltons. Anthony worked constantly, sometimes sleeping in his car between jobs to save time. He had mortgaged their house to keep Lewis racing. Every weekend was a sacrifice for the whole family. Through it all, Lewis kept his notebook with 44 written on the cover. By now, the pages were filled with notes about racing lines, braking points, and setups. But he never forgot what he'd written underneath that number. "I'll prove her wrong." Mrs. Clark became a small but powerful motivation. On days when Lewis felt like giving up, when the racism cut too deep, or the money problems seemed too great, he remembered his math teacher telling him that kids from Stevenage don't become Formula One drivers. Years passed. Mrs. Clark occasionally saw Lewis's name in motorsport articles. He won the Formula Renault Championship in 2003. Then he moved up to Formula 3, winning that championship too in 2005. Each time, she added the article to her folder, which was growing thicker. She never mentioned Lewis to anyone. What would she say? That she had tried to crush this boy's dreams? That she had been completely wrong? It was easier to keep it to herself. By 2006, Lewis had reached GP2, the final step before Formula One. Mrs. Clark watched a race on TV one Sunday, surprising herself with how nervous she felt as Lewis fought for the lead. When he won with a spectacular overtaking move, she found herself cheering alone in her living room. "He might actually do it," she said to herself. The thought both amazed and troubled her. In December 2006, the news broke. McLaren announced their drivers for the 2007 Formula One season: Fernando Alonso, the reigning world champion, and Lewis Hamilton, a rookie from Stevenage. Mrs. Clark saw the announcement in the newspaper on her way to school. She had to sit down on a bench, the winter air suddenly feeling colder around her. Lewis Hamilton had done it. The boy she said would never make it was now one of just 20 Formula One drivers in the world. The boy who failed her math tests would be racing in Melbourne, Monaco, and Monza. That day, Mrs. Clark taught her classes as usual, but her mind kept drifting to Lewis. Had her harsh words motivated him, or had they hurt him? Had he forgotten all about her while she kept his articles in a secret folder? One of her current students, Maya, was struggling with equations. Mrs. Clark stopped beside her desk. "I don't get it," Maya sighed. "I'm never going to understand algebra." Mrs. Clark almost gave her usual speech about working harder, about how some students just weren't meant for advanced math. Instead, she surprised herself. "Don't say never," Mrs. Clark told Maya. "With enough practice and determination, you might surprise yourself. And me." Maya looked up, confused by this uncharacteristic encouragement from her strict math teacher. But Mrs. Clark had already moved on to the next student, a small, unfamiliar smile on her face. That evening, Mrs. Clark took out her folder of Lewis Hamilton articles and spread them across her dining table. From karting to Formula Renault, to Formula 3 to GP2, and now, finally, to Formula One. An incredible journey for any driver, let alone one from a council estate in Stevenage. Mrs. Clark wondered what Lewis was feeling right now, on the cusp of his Formula One debut. Was he nervous? Confident? Did he ever think about that math teacher who doubted him? As she gathered up the articles, Mrs. Clark whispered, "Prove me wrong, Lewis. Prove me wrong." March 2007 arrived. Mrs. Clark was now head of mathematics at her school in Hartford. Her role included less teaching and more administration, which suited her organized nature. On a Sunday morning, she sat at home grading papers when her phone rang. "Verity, are you watching this?" It was her sister, Linda. "Watching what?" "The race. The Formula One race in Australia." Mrs. Clark frowned. "Why would I be watching racing?" "That boy from Stevenage is racing. Isn't that near your old school?" "Lewis?" "Hamilton! He's doing brilliantly!" Mrs. Clark's heart skipped a beat. "I'll call you back," she said quickly, reaching for her TV remote. She flipped channels until she found it. The Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne. The commentators were talking excitedly about a rookie driver who was now running in third place. The camera switched to a sleek silver McLaren car with the number 22 on it. Inside was Lewis Hamilton, the boy she had told would never make it, third place on his debut, one commentator said. "Absolutely remarkable." Mrs. Clark sat on the edge of her sofa, hands clasped tightly together. When Lewis crossed the finish line in third position, she felt a strange mix of emotions, amazement, pride, and a twinge of shame for having doubted him so firmly. After the race, Lewis stood on the podium beside Fernando Alonso and Kimi Räikkönen, spraying champagne and smiling widely. Mrs. Clark took a photo of her TV screen with her new digital camera, another addition to her folder. The next day at school, a fellow teacher rushed into her classroom before first period. "Isn't that the boy you used to teach?" he asked, holding up the sports page with Lewis Hamilton's face on it. Mrs. Clark felt her cheeks flush. "I had many students," she said vaguely. "Excuse me, I need to prepare for class." As the 2007 season continued, Mrs. Clark found herself scheduling her weekends around Formula One races. Lewis continued to impress everyone, finishing on the podium, race after race. He won his first Grand Prix in Canada, just his 6th Formula One race. The newspapers called him a phenomenon. Mrs. Clark watched it all from afar, her folder growing thicker with each race. She noticed how Lewis handled himself. In interviews, polite, well-spoken, always thanking his team and his father. Very different from the boy who had struggled in her math class 9 years earlier. In October, a student brought a racing magazine to school. On the cover was Lewis Hamilton with the headline, "From Stevenage to Superstar." Mrs. Clark borrowed it, saying she wanted to read about this local success story. That evening, she found an article inside where Lewis talked about his journey. "I had teachers who believed in me," Lewis was quoted as saying, "and I had teachers who didn't. Both types motivated me, for different reasons." Mrs. Clark read the line several times. Was he thinking of her when he said that? Did he remember their conversation after all these years? She carefully cut out the article and added it to her collection. As the season reached its final races, Lewis was shockingly leading the championship. A rookie hadn't come close to winning the title in decades, yet here he was, ahead of his two-time world champion teammate. The school term ended for Christmas break, just before the final race in Brazil. Mrs. Clark declined invitations to holiday parties, telling friends she wasn't feeling well. In reality, she wanted to watch the race alone. Rain fell in São Paulo as Lewis fought for the championship. Mrs. Clark paced her living room as his car slipped back in the wet conditions. When his car slowed with a technical problem, Dropping him to 7th place, she put her hand over her mouth to stifle a cry of frustration. "Come on, Lewis," she whispered. "You can do this." But it wasn't to be. Lewis finished 7th, losing the championship by a single point to Kimi Räikkönen. Mrs. Clark felt a deep disappointment that surprised her with its intensity. When the camera showed Lewis putting on a brave face for interviews, she found herself wiping away tears. "Next year," she told the television. "You'll do it next year." That night, Mrs. Clark took out a notepad and began writing a letter. "Dear Lewis, you won't remember me, but I was your math teacher at Peartree Junior School. I wanted to congratulate you on your remarkable first season in Formula One." She wrote for an hour, explaining how wrong she had been to discourage him, how proud she was of what he had accomplished, how she had followed his career from afar, but when she read it back, the words seemed hollow, too little too late. What right did she have to contact him now? To claim any part in his success, even a negative one? Her words might open old wounds for Lewis, or worse, he might not remember her at all, making her letter seem strange and self-important. Mrs. Clark tore up the letter and threw it away. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt. Some words couldn't be taken back. The 2008 season arrived. Mrs. Clark continued watching Lewis's races secretly. His car now bore the number 22, but in interviews, he still mentioned his attachment to 44, his karting number. When he won the British Grand Prix at Silverstone in pouring rain, lapping almost the entire field, Mrs. Clark cheered out loud in her empty house. As summer turned to autumn, Lewis was again fighting for the championship, this time against Felipe Massa. Mrs. Clark found herself checking Formula One news websites daily, something she would have found unimaginable just 2 years earlier. "The math teacher who said he'd never make it," she muttered to herself one evening, shaking her head at her own poor judgment. "What else have I been wrong about all these years?" As the season finale in Brazil approached, Mrs. Clark felt a strange connection to a young man she hadn't seen in a decade, a student she had underestimated, whose dream she had dismissed. This time, she hoped with all her heart that he would prove her wrong once and for all. November 2nd, 2008, the Brazilian Grand Prix at Interlagos. Mrs. Clark had declined a Sunday lunch invitation from her sister, claiming she had too much work to do. Instead, she sat alone in her living room, television turned to the race coverage. The situation was clear but nerve-wracking. Lewis Hamilton needed to finish 5th or better to become world champion, no matter what his rival Felipe Massa did. The Brazilian crowd favored Massa, who was driving for Ferrari. They cheered wildly when rain began to fall just before the race. "That makes it harder," Mrs. Clark muttered, remembering how changeable conditions could lead to mistakes or accidents. As the race started, she perched on the edge of her sofa. Lewis got a good start, but soon dropped back to 6th place, one position lower than he needed for the title. "Come on, Lewis," she whispered. "Just one more place." The race unfolded like a drama. Rain fell, then stopped, then fell again. Drivers gambled on tire choices. Lewis fought his way back to 4th place, safely in a championship position. Mrs. Clark allowed herself to breathe. Then, with just a few laps remaining, the rain intensified. Most drivers, including Lewis, pitted for wet weather tires. As he rejoined the track, Lewis was in 5th place, just enough to win the championship, but with no margin for error. Mrs. Clark stood up, too tense to remain seated. "Hold the position," she said to the screen. "Just hold it." With 3 laps to go, disaster struck. Timo Glock, running ahead of Lewis, was still on dry weather tires, struggling for grip in the rain. Lewis tried to pass him, but ran wide, allowing Sebastian Vettel to overtake. Lewis was now in 6th place. "No!" Mrs. Clark cried out. If the race ended this way, Lewis would lose the championship by a single point. Again! The television commentators were frantic. Hamilton needs to retake that position. He's got 2 laps to pass either Vettel or Glock. Mrs. Clark pressed her hands against her mouth, heart pounding. Lewis chased Vettel, but couldn't get close enough to pass. Up ahead, Felipe Massa crossed the finish line in 1st place. His Ferrari team erupted in celebration, believing their driver had won the title. "Last corner of the last lap," the commentator shouted. Mrs. Clark watched, barely breathing, as Lewis's silver McLaren suddenly appeared behind Timo Glock's Toyota. Glock was crawling on his dry tires in the rain. In the final corner of the final lap, Lewis passed him, crossing the line in 5th place. "Is that Glock? Is that Glock going slowly?" the commentator screamed. "It is! Lewis Hamilton has done it! He's done it! He's world champion!" Mrs. Clark collapsed back onto her sofa, tears streaming down her face. On the screen, Lewis realized what had happened. "Did I do it? Did I do it?" he asked his team over the radio, voice cracking with emotion. "Yes, Lewis, you're world champion," came the reply. Mrs. Clark watched as the youngest world champion in Formula One history absorbed the news. Lewis, overwhelmed, could barely speak. The Ferrari celebrations stopped abruptly as they realized what had happened. "You did it," Mrs. Clark said softly to the television. "The boy from Stevenage did it." Later that evening, when her hands had stopped shaking, Mrs. Clark took out her folder of Lewis Hamilton articles. She spread them across her dining table. The journey from karting champion to Formula One world champion laid out in newsprint and magazine clippings. She began writing another letter. "Dear Lewis, today you became world champion. I doubt you remember me, but I was your math teacher at Peartree Junior School. I once told you that children from Stevenage don't become Formula One drivers." Once again, the words didn't seem right. What could she possibly say to him now? How could she explain that she had followed his career for years, secretly hoping he would succeed? It would sound strange, even stalker-like. Mrs. Clark tore up the second letter, just as she had torn up the first. Some things were better left unsaid. Some apologies came too late. Instead, she opened her laptop and ordered something online, something she never thought she would buy. A red Ferrari cap with the number 44 embroidered on it. Not because she supported Ferrari, but because it was the only Formula One merchandise she could find, with Lewis's lucky number from his karting days. When the cap arrived a week later, Mrs. Clark placed it carefully in her wardrobe, where no one would see it. It was her private acknowledgement of being wrong, her silent apology to a boy who had defied all odds and proved that dreams, even the wildest ones, sometimes come true. That night, she fell asleep wondering what Lewis Hamilton was doing at that very moment. Was he celebrating with champagne? Was he calling his father? Or was he, perhaps, thinking of all the people who said he couldn't do it, and how he had proved them wrong? The years after Lewis's championship were strange ones for Mrs. Clark. She continued teaching mathematics, continued her neat and orderly life, but something had changed. Whenever a student struggled, whenever she felt the urge to tell them to be more realistic about their dreams, she thought of Lewis Hamilton and held her tongue. Sunrise Monday 9 arrived, and Lewis's McLaren car was no longer competitive. Mrs. Clark watched as he struggled in races, finishing far from the podium. The newspapers that had celebrated him now questioned his skills, his temperament, his focus. Mrs. Clark found herself becoming defensive on his behalf. "They don't understand," she muttered one Sunday, turning off the television after a difficult race for Lewis. "It's the car, not the driver." She was right. Formula One was as much about the machine as the person controlling it. For the next few years, Lewis fought with an underperforming McLaren, occasionally winning races through sheer talent, but unable to challenge for another championship. In 2012, Mrs. Clark read news that shocked the racing world. Lewis Hamilton was leaving McLaren, the team that had supported him since he was a boy, to join Mercedes. The newspapers called it a terrible mistake. Mercedes was struggling, nowhere near the front of the grid. Why would a champion leave a top team for a midfield one? "He knows what he's doing," Mrs. Clark said to her cat, who was sitting on the newspaper. She had long since stopped questioning Lewis's judgment. By 2013, Mrs. Clark had retired from full-time teaching. She was 61 now, with gray streaks in her brown hair and reading glasses she hadn't needed 10 years before. She took on part-time work, tutoring struggling students in mathematics. One afternoon, a boy named Elijah sat at her dining table, staring hopelessly at algebra problems. Like Lewis had been, he was 13 and much more interested in things outside school. In his case, music. "I don't get why I need this," Elijah complained, tapping his pencil against the table. "I'm going to be a music producer. When will I ever use algebra?" Mrs. Clark studied him thoughtfully. 10 years ago, she would have lectured him about being practical, about how few people made it in the music industry, about needing qualifications to fall back on. Instead, she said, "Tell me about your music." Elijah looked up, surprised. His face lit up as he described the beats he made on his computer, the small studio his uncle had helped him build in his bedroom, the local artists he'd already produced tracks for. When he finished, Mrs. Clark nodded. "You remind me of a student I once had. Everyone told him his dream was impossible, that he should focus on more practical goals." She picked up a magazine from the side table, a Formula One publication with Lewis on the cover. This was him, Elijah's. Eyes widened. "You taught Lewis Hamilton?" "I did." "And do you know what I told him?" Mrs. Clark took a deep breath. "I told him he would never make it. That boys from Stevenage don't become Formula One drivers." Elijah stared at her, shocked. "For real? For real? It's one of my biggest regrets." She set the magazine down. "So I won't tell you to give up on music. But I will tell you this. If you're willing to work harder than everyone else, if you're truly dedicated to your dream, then you have a chance." "But I still gotta learn this algebra?" Elijah asked, grinning slightly. "You do," Mrs. Clark replied with a small smile. "Even Lewis uses math now, for race strategy, for understanding his car's performance. You never know when knowledge will be useful." They returned to the algebra problems, but something had changed. Elijah worked with new focus, and Mrs. Clark taught with new patience. Meanwhile, Lewis Hamilton was preparing for the 2014 season with Mercedes. Few people knew it yet, but the team had been developing a revolutionary new hybrid engine that would change Formula One, and Lewis would be the one to drive it to victory. When the 2014 season began, Mrs. Clark watched in delight as Lewis dominated in his silver Mercedes. The car was far superior to the competition, but Lewis's driving was sublime. He fought a season-long battle with his teammate Nico Rosberg, eventually securing his second world championship. Mrs. Clark celebrated quietly in her living room, opening a small bottle of champagne she had saved for the occasion. She raised a glass to the television as Lewis stood on the top step of the podium in Abu Dhabi. "Well done, Lewis," she said softly. Well done! The following year, 2015, brought more success for Lewis and more pride for Mrs. Clark. A third world championship, matching his hero Ayrton Senna's total. Lewis had become more than just a racing driver. He was now a global celebrity, appearing in fashion magazines and music videos, dating famous women, living between Monaco, London, and Los Angeles. Mrs. Clark followed it all from afar, collecting articles and watching interviews. She noticed how Lewis had changed, more confident in himself, more willing to speak out about issues that mattered to him, especially racism in motorsport. He supported young drivers from backgrounds like his, created a commission to increase diversity in racing, used his platform to fight for equality. This Lewis was so different from the shy boy who had sat in the back of her classroom, drawing race cars instead of solving equations. Yet, in his determination, in his self-belief, he was exactly the same. In interviews, Lewis often mentioned teachers who had believed in him when he was young. But sometimes, he also mentioned those who hadn't. "There were people who told me I couldn't do it," he said in one interview that Mrs. Clark watched from her sofa. "Teachers who said I should be more realistic, that racing wasn't for people like me. I used that as fuel." Each time he said something like this, Mrs. Clark wondered if he was thinking of her, if her discouraging words had actually helped motivate him in some strange way. The thought brought her little comfort. She would rather have been the teacher who believed in him. One thing puzzled her, though. In every race, no matter which number was on his car for that season, Lewis always had 44 incorporated somewhere in his helmet design or race suit. His social media handles all included the number. When Formula One changed its rules in 2014 to let drivers choose their own permanent numbers, Lewis immediately selected 44. "It was my first racing number when I started winning in karting," he explained in an interview. "It's special to me." Mrs. Clark remembered the notebook with 44 written on the cover. The notebook where Lewis had written, "I'll prove her wrong." Was he still, after all these years of success, trying to prove something? Or was it simply a good luck charm, a connection to his beginnings? She would probably never know. Their paths had diverged so completely. Him to worldwide fame and fortune, her to a quiet retirement in Hertfordshire. What were the chances they would ever cross again? And yet, sometimes the most unlikely paths do intersect in the most unexpected ways. The 2016 season was difficult for Lewis Hamilton. Despite having the fastest car, he lost the World Championship to his teammate Nico Rosberg after a season of mechanical problems and tense battles. Mrs. Clark watched the final race in Abu Dhabi with a heavy heart, as Lewis tried everything to keep his title, but fell short. "He'll be back," she told her cat, who had become her regular companion for race viewings. "Lewis always comes back stronger." She was right. After Rosberg suddenly retired, Lewis returned in 2017 with renewed determination. New regulations had made Ferrari competitive again, and Lewis faced a serious challenge from Sebastian Vettel. Mrs. Clark followed every race. Now watching on a new large-screen television she had bought specifically for Formula One weekends. "Come on, Lewis," she whispered, during a particularly tense battle at the Belgian Grand Prix. When he held off Vettel to win, she clapped her hands in delight, startling her cat. By the end of 2017, Lewis had secured his fourth World Championship, equaling Vettel's total. The newspapers that had doubted his Mercedes move now hailed him as one of the greatest drivers in history. Mrs. Clark's collection of articles and race programs filled 2 folders now. She had never attended a race in person, though she often thought about it. Something held her back. Perhaps the fear of being recognized, of having to explain her interest in Lewis Hamilton to anyone who might ask. The 2018 season brought more battles with Vettel and more victories for Lewis. Mrs. Clark, now 66, followed it all with an enthusiasm that surprised her friends, who had never known her to be interested in sports. "I just find the strategy fascinating," she would explain when asked about her sudden Formula One knowledge. "It's all mathematics, really. Fuel calculations, tire degradation, racing lines, very educational." In truth, she had developed a genuine love for the sport, but her main interest remained Lewis Hamilton, the boy she had underestimated, who had gone on to achieve greatness beyond anyone's imagination. That summer, Mrs. Clark's daughter gave her a special birthday present: tickets to the Silverstone Circuit Museum. "I know you like Formula One now," her daughter said. "I thought you might enjoy seeing some of the historical cars." Mrs. Clark accepted the gift with thanks, though privately she felt nervous. Silverstone was where Lewis raced in the British Grand Prix each year. It felt strangely intimate to visit, like she was crossing an invisible boundary between observer and participant in his story. Nevertheless, on a sunny Tuesday in August, Mrs. Clark found herself at the museum with her two grandchildren, Thomas and Emma, ages 10 and 8. They were more excited about the interactive displays than the historical cars, but Mrs. Clark moved slowly through the exhibits, reading every plaque, studying every machine. When they reached the display of championship-winning cars, Mrs. Clark stopped in front of Lewis Hamilton's 2008 McLaren MP423. The silver and red car gleamed under the museum lights, looking both powerful and delicate. A video screen nearby showed highlights of that dramatic Brazilian Grand Prix where Lewis had won his first title. "Grandma, is that your favorite driver?" Thomas asked, noticing her expression. "Yes," Mrs. Clark admitted. Is very special." As she stood there, lost in memories. Someone tapped her on the shoulder. Mrs. Clark turned to find a tall black man with a friendly smile. Something about him seemed familiar. "Excuse me," he said, "but aren't you Mrs. Clark? From Peartree Junior School?" Mrs. Clark's heart froze. Standing before her was Anthony Hamilton, Lewis's father. Older now, with gray in his beard, but unmistakable. "Mr. Hamilton," she managed to say. "Yes, I am." Anthony's smile widened. "I thought it was you. It's been what, 20 years? What brings you to Silverstone?" Mrs. Clark gestured weakly to her grandchildren, who were pressing buttons on an interactive display. "Family outing. My grandchildren." Anthony nodded, glancing at the children. "Great ages to get them interested in racing." He looked back at Mrs. Clark, studying her face. There was something in his eyes that made her nervous. A knowledge, a memory. "Lewis always remembered what you told him," Anthony said quietly. Mrs. Clark felt her cheeks burning with shame. So Lewis had told his father about that conversation, about how she had discouraged him, told him his dreams were unrealistic. She began, not knowing what to say. "It fueled him," Anthony continued. "Whenever things got tough, he'd remember the people who said he couldn't do it, used it as motivation." Before Mrs. Clark could respond, a museum staff member approached. Them. "Mr. Hamilton, they're ready for you in the conference room." Anthony nodded to the staff member, then turned back to Mrs. Clark. "I'm here for a meeting about Lewis's charity work." "It was good to see you, Mrs. Clark." He extended his hand, and she shook it automatically, still processing his words. Had her discouragement actually helped Lewis in some strange way? "It was good to see you too," she managed to say. As Anthony walked away, he called over his shoulder, "If you ever want tickets to a race, let me know. I'm sure Lewis would be interested to see you again." Mrs. Clark stood frozen, watching him disappear through a door marked "Staff Only." Her grandchildren ran up to her, excited about something they'd discovered, but she barely heard them. All she could think was, "Louis knows I'm here. Or at least, he will soon." That evening, back at home, Mrs. Clark sat in her garden watching the sunset. Her mind kept replaying the encounter with Anthony Hamilton. After all these years, he had recognized her immediately, and Louis, apparently, still remembered her words. The thought both troubled and fascinated her. How would Louis react if they met again? Would he be angry? Amused? Indifferent? She had no way of knowing. As darkness fell, Mrs. Clark made a decision. She would not contact Anthony about race tickets. Some chapters were better left closed, some bridges better left uncrossed. Let Louis Hamilton continue his brilliant career without the complication of facing a teacher who had once doubted him. Besides, what could she possibly say to him after all this time? Life continued for Mrs. Clark. She tutored students, tended her garden, visited her grandchildren, and watched every Formula One race. Louis Hamilton went from strength to strength, securing his 5th World Championship in 2018 with dominant performances that left his rivals trailing. When 2019 arrived, Mrs. Clark's daughter gave her another surprise: an annual membership to the Silverstone Circuit Museum. "You enjoyed it so much last time," her daughter explained. "Now you can go whenever you want." Mrs. Clark accepted with mixed feelings. She hadn't told anyone about her encounter with Anthony Hamilton. What, were the chances of running into him again? Surely very slim. Still, she waited 3 months before using the membership. On a quiet Wednesday in March, when school groups and tourists would be few, she drove to Silverstone. The museum was nearly empty, just how she preferred it. Mrs. Clark moved through the exhibits slowly, reading information she had already read, studying cars she had already studied. When she reached Louis Hamilton's section, which had grown considerably since her last visit, she paused to watch video highlights of his career. "He's quite something, isn't he?" The voice beside her made Mrs. Clark jump. She turned to find a tall, elegant woman with gray-streaked hair standing next to her. "I'm sorry," the woman said. "I didn't mean to startle you. I'm Carmen, one of the museum curators." "No worries," Mrs. Clark replied, trying to calm her racing heart. For a moment, she had feared another Hamilton family encounter. "Yes, he's quite remarkable," Carmen smiled. "Are you a longtime fan?" Mrs. Clark hesitated. "In a way. I followed his career from the beginning." "Ah, one of the originals, before all the championships and the knighthood." Mrs. Clark nodded, though the mention of a knighthood confused her. Had Louis Hamilton been knighted? She made a mental note to check the news later. "I'm helping organize a special exhibition about Louis this summer," Carmen continued, focusing on his early years and his journey to Formula One. "We're collecting stories from people who knew him back then." Mrs. Clark felt a flutter of panic. "That sounds interesting. Did you ever see him race as a boy? At the kart tracks?" "No," Mrs. Clark said quickly. "No, I just followed his career in the news." Carmen looked disappointed but handed her a business card. "Well, if you know anyone who did know him in those early days, we'd love to hear from them. We're interviewing his old friends, teammates, coaches, even looking for his teachers." Mrs. Clark's fingers tightened around the card. "His teachers?" "Yes. We think it would add a nice dimension to have perspectives from his school days. How he balanced education and racing, that sort of thing." "I see," Mrs. Clark said weakly. I'll let you know if I think of anyone." Carmen thanked her, and moved on to help other visitors. Mrs. Clark stood frozen, staring at the business card. Her past seemed determined to catch up with her, one way or another. That evening, Mrs. Clark searched online for news about Lewis Hamilton. Indeed, there were articles discussing the possibility of a knighthood in his future, recognizing not just his sporting achievements, but his charity work and advocacy for diversity in motorsport. She read about his projects beyond racing, his fashion line, his music collaborations, his environmental activism. The shy boy from her classroom had become not just a champion, but a cultural icon. Her finger hovered over Carmen's contact information in her phone. What if she did call? What if she did share her story? Not to claim any credit for Lewis's success, but to publicly admit how wrong she had been? Mrs. Clark closed her phone without calling. Some stories weren't hers to tell. Months passed. Lewis continued winning races, breaking records, setting new standards in Formula One. Mrs. Clark continued watching, her admiration growing with each masterful drive. In November 2019, she visited the Silverstone Museum again. The special Lewis Hamilton exhibition was in full swing, drawing large crowds even on weekdays. Mrs. Clark moved through it slowly, absorbing every detail. Photos of Lewis as a child in his first kart, his early trophies, race suits he had worn in junior categories. One display stopped her cold. Behind glass was a collection of Lewis's school items, notebooks, drawings of race cars, report cards, and there, right in the center, was a worn notebook with 44 written on the cover. Mrs. Clark stepped closer, heart pounding. Could it be the same one? The notebook where Lewis had written his promise to prove her wrong? A small card beside it read, Lewis Hamilton's Mathematics Notebook from Peartree Junior School, Stevenage, 1998. On loan from the Hamilton family collection. Mrs. Clark stared at it, transfixed. If she could just see inside, just check if those words were there. It's quite moving, isn't it? Mrs. Clark turned to find Carmen beside her again. The notebook? Carmen nodded. Lewis specifically requested it be included. Said it was one of his most important possessions from childhood. Something about a promise he made to himself. Mrs. Clark felt lightheaded. Did he? Did he say what promise? Not specifically. Just that it reminded him to never give up, no matter what anyone said. Carmen studied Mrs. Clark's face. Are you all right? You look pale. I'm fine, Mrs. Clark said quickly. It's an emotional exhibition. It is, Carmen agreed. Lewis's story touches so many people. All those obstacles he overcame. Including me, Mrs. Clark thought. I was one of those obstacles. As she left the museum that day, Mrs. Clark felt a strange mix of emotions. Shame for her past discouragement, pride in Lewis's achievements, and wonder at how their lives remained connected by that notebook with 44 on the cover. What she didn't know was that this connection was about to become much stronger, in a way she could never have anticipated. The 2020 season started unlike any other. A global pandemic had changed everything, delaying races and eventually forcing them to run without spectators. Mrs. Clark, now self-isolating at home like millions of others, found Formula One to be one of her few remaining pleasures. At least I can still watch Lewis race, she told her daughter during one of their daily phone calls. Though it's strange seeing empty grandstands. Despite the unusual circumstances, Lewis Hamilton continued his dominance. His Mercedes team had built another exceptional car, and Lewis was driving better than ever. As the shortened season progressed, it became clear he was approaching a historic milestone equaling Michael Schumacher's record of 7 world championships, long considered unbreakable. Mrs. Clark followed every race from her living room, now joined virtually by her grandchildren, who had become fans after their Silverstone visit. They would video call during races, cheering together when Lewis took pole positions and victories. "Grandma, why do you like Lewis Hamilton so much?" Emma asked during one call. "Is it because he's British?" Mrs. Clark hesitated. "Partly that, but mostly because he proved that, with enough determination, you can achieve anything, even when people tell you it's impossible." By November, Lewis needed just one more strong result to secure his 7th title. The Turkish Grand Prix would be held at Istanbul Park, on a weekend when rain was forecast. Mrs. Clark woke early on Sunday morning, nervous energy preventing her from sleeping. The race began on a wet track, with Lewis starting 6th after struggling in qualifying. Mrs. Clark watched anxiously as cars slipped and slid on the treacherous surface. But as the race progressed, Lewis began to show his exceptional skill in difficult conditions. While others pitted for new tires, Lewis nursed his worn intermediates, lapping several seconds faster than anyone else. By the end, he had lapped almost the entire field. Masterclass, the commentators called it. One of the greatest drives in Formula One history. When Lewis crossed the finish line to win the race and secure his 7th championship, Mrs. Clark found herself crying. Tears of joy, pride, and something else she couldn't quite name. Perhaps vindication, not for herself, but for the boy who had dared to dream beyond what she thought possible. After the race, Lewis gave an emotional interview. Helmet off, tears in his eyes, he spoke directly to the camera. "To all the kids out there who dream the impossible, you can do this. Don't let anyone tell you you can't. Don't let anyone discourage you from your dreams." Mrs. Clark felt his words like a physical touch. Had she been wrong about everything in her teaching career? How many other students had she discouraged over the years? That night, she couldn't sleep. At 3 in the morning, she sat at her desk and began to write another letter to Lewis. This time, she was determined to finish it. "Dear Sir Lewis, you won't remember me, but I was your mathematics teacher at Peartree Junior School in 1998. I'm writing to congratulate you on your 7th World Championship and to apologize. 22 years ago, I told you that boys from Stevenage don't become Formula One drivers. I told you to focus on more realistic goals. I was wrong, so profoundly, completely wrong. I've followed your entire career, from your first podium in Australia to your 7th championship in Turkey yesterday. Each victory, each championship, has been a reminder of my mistake in underestimating you. Recently, I saw your mathematics notebook displayed at the Silverstone Museum, the one with 44 written on the cover. I remember when you wrote that number. I remember telling you that day that your dreams were unrealistic. I want you to know how sorry I am for discouraging you, and I want to thank you for proving me wrong. Your success has changed how I speak to young people about their dreams. With deepest admiration and apologies, Verity Clark. Mrs. Clark read the letter over several times, making small corrections. In the morning light, she addressed an envelope to Lewis Hamilton, care of Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team, then drove to the post office before she could change her mind. It probably won't reach him, she told herself as she handed the EU letter to the postal worker. Probably gets thousands of letters from fans. But sending it felt right, like closing a circle that had been open for too long. Weeks passed with no response, as Mrs. Clark expected. Christmas came and went. A new year began, bringing news of Lewis's knighthood in the New Year's honors. List. Sir Lewis Hamilton, the boy from her classroom who had climbed to the very pinnacle of his sport and beyond. One rainy Tuesday in February, a package arrived at Mrs. Clark's house. The return address showed Mercedes-AMG Petronas F1 team headquarters in Brackley. Mrs. Clark stared at it, her heart racing. With trembling fingers, she opened the package. Inside was a Mercedes team cap, signed by Lewis Hamilton, and a handwritten fille toute note on team letterhead. Mrs. Clark, thank you for your letter. Yes, I remember our talk well. It's funny how some words stay with us forever, isn't it? Would you like to come to the British Grand Prix at Silverstone this year as my guest? I think we have a lot to talk about. Lewis Hamilton, Dr. 44. Below the signature was a contact number for his personal assistant. Mrs. Clark sat down heavily, the cap and note in her lap. After 23 years, Lewis Hamilton wanted to meet her. The boy whose dreams she had dismissed now wanted to talk to her. The teacher who had been so wrong. What would she say to him? How could she possibly explain herself? And what did Lewis want to say to her after all these years? With shaking hands, Mrs. Clark picked up her phone and dialed the number. "Hello, Angela Cullen speaking," answered a woman with a New Zealand accent. "Hello, I'm Verity Clark," she said, her voice unsteady. "I received a note from Lewis Hamilton inviting me to the British Grand Prix." "Mrs. Clark?" "Yes, Lewis mentioned you might call. He asked me to arrange everything for your visit." Shakti's conversation that followed felt surreal. Angela, Lewis's personal physiotherapist and assistant, was friendly and efficient, asking about Mrs. Clark's preferences and any special needs she might have. "The British Grand Prix is in July," Angela explained. "Lewis would like you to have full paddock access for the entire weekend. Would that suit you?" "Paddock access?" Mrs. Clark asked, unfamiliar with the term. Angela explained that the paddock was the exclusive area where drivers and teams prepared for races. Very few people received such access. "That sounds overwhelming," Mrs. Clark admitted. "Don't worry," Angela assured her. "I'll be your guide for the day. Lewis is very excited to meet you." After they hung up, Mrs. Clark sat in her living room, stunned. The British Grand Prix was 4 months away. 4 months to prepare for meeting Lewis Hamilton face to face. After 23 years, spring passed in a blur. Mrs. Clark told no one about the invitation, not even her daughter. Who would believe that Sir Lewis Hamilton, 7-time world champion, had personally invited his old math teacher to be his guest at Silverstone? She watched the start of the 2021 Formula One season with new interest. Lewis faced a strong challenge from Red Bull's Max Verstappen. Their battles were intense, sometimes controversial. Mrs. Clark found herself even more invested in Lewis's success now that they were going to meet. As July approached, she began to worry about what to wear, what to say, whether Lewis was inviting her out of kindness or to confront her about her discouragement all those years ago. She lost sleep, rehearsing conversations in her head. 2 weeks before the Grand Prix, a package arrived from Mercedes. Inside was a team jacket with Hamilton's number 44 on the sleeve, a credential badge on a lanyard, and detailed instructions for the race weekend. The morning of the British Grand Prix dawned sunny and warm. Mrs. Clark, dressed in the Mercedes Antitithi team jacket over a simple blouse and trousers, drove to Silverstone with butterflies in her stomach. Special parking had been arranged, and as she approached the circuit, she saw the massive grandstands filled with fans waving British flags. At a private entrance, she presented her credential to security. The guard's eyes widened slightly when he saw the all-access pass with Hamilton Guest printed on it. "Through here, ma'am," he said, suddenly more respectful. "Someone will meet you." Indeed, waiting inside was Angela Cullen, Lewis's blonde assistant, who was easily recognizable from TV coverage. She greeted Mrs. Clark warmly. "Louis is in team meetings this morning," Angela explained, leading her through busy areas where mechanics and engineers rushed about. "He asked me to give you a tour and bring you to the garage afterward." The next hour was a blur as Angela showed her the paddock, explaining the operations of Formula One teams. They passed famous drivers and team principals, some of whom nodded respectfully to Angela. Mrs. Clark felt completely out of place among the glamorous people and high-tech equipment. "Don't be nervous," Angela said kindly, noticing Mrs. Clark's discomfort. "Louis really is looking forward to seeing you." "Did he tell you who I am?" Mrs. Clark asked. "Why he invited me?" Angela nodded. "He said you were his math teacher. That you played an important role in his story." Mrs. Clark swallowed hard. "Not a positive one, I'm afraid." Angela smiled mysteriously. "I think you might be surprised." They arrived at the Mercedes garage, where mechanics worked on 2 silver cars. The noise and activity were overwhelming. Angela guided her to a quiet corner and handed her a headset. "These will protect your ears and let you hear team communications," she explained. "Wait here. Louis will come find you after his engineering briefing." Left alone, Mrs. Clark watched the garage activity with fascination. She could see Louis's car being prepared, the number 44 prominently displayed. On the wall behind it hung his helmet, also featuring the number that had become his trademark. "Mrs. Clark?" The voice came from behind her. She turned and found herself face to face with Louis Hamilton. He looked so different from the boy she had known. Taller, more confident, his face now sporting a neatly trimmed beard. But his eyes were the same, bright and intense. "Louis," she managed to say. "Thank you for inviting me." He smiled, and in that smile, she saw a flash of the 13-year-old boy from her classroom. "I'm glad you came. I wasn't sure you would." There was an awkward moment of silence. Then Louis gestured to a door. "Let's talk somewhere quieter." He led her to a private room within the team area, a small lounge with comfortable chairs and a window overlooking the track. On a table sat 2 cups of tea, already prepared. "I remembered you always had tea in class," Louis said, seeing her surprise. Mrs. Clark felt tears threatening. Such a small detail to remember after all these years? They sat down, and Louis studied her face. "Your letter meant a lot to me," he said finally. "I've been thinking about you over the years, wondering if you saw how things turned out." "I saw," Mrs. Clark replied quietly. "I followed your entire career, every race, every championship. Her voice caught. "I was so wrong, Louis, so terribly wrong to discourage you." Louis nodded slowly. "When you told me boys from Stevenage don't become Formula One drivers, it hurt. I won't pretend it didn't." Mrs. Clark looked down at her hands. "I'm so sorry." "But," Louis continued, "in a strange way, it also helped me. Every time someone said I couldn't do something, because of my background, my color, where I came from, I remembered that conversation in your classroom. I used it as fuel." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. Mrs. Clark recognized it immediately. The math test from 1998, covered in her red marks. "You kept it?" she whispered, astonished. "I did," Louis nodded. "Not out of anger, but because sometimes we all need something to prove wrong." He smiled slightly. "I didn't keep it just because of the grades. I kept it because, on the back, I wrote down all the things people said I couldn't do. Your words were the first on the list." Mrs. Clark felt a tear slide down her cheek. "I wish I could take them back." "I don't," Louis said simply. "They were part of my journey. We all need people who believe in us. My dad never stopped believing, even when we had nothing. But sometimes we also need people who doubt us, to show them what's possible. They talked for almost an hour about his career, her teaching, the changes they'd both seen over the decades. Louis was gracious, thoughtful, nothing like the celebrity persona she had seen on television. As their conversation drew to a close, Louis looked at his watch. "I need to prepare for qualifying soon." He stood up and reached into a bag beside his chair. "I brought something for you." He handed her a Mercedes team shirt with the number 44 prominently displayed. "I'd be honored if you'd wear this tomorrow for the race." Mrs. Clark took it with trembling hands. "I will. Thank you, Louis." As they walked back toward the garage, Louis asked, "Will you be all right finding your way around tomorrow? Angela can help you." "I'll be fine," Mrs. Clark assured him, feeling strangely calm now that their meeting had gone so well. "Louis, before you go, may I ask you something?" He nodded. "Why did you invite me here after all this time? You could have just sent a polite note acknowledging my letter." Louis looked at her thoughtfully. "Because my story isn't complete without yours, and because there's something I've never told anyone about that day in your classroom." Before he could continue, a team member called urgently from the garage. "Louis, Toto needs you for the strategy meeting." Louis sighed. "I have to go. We'll talk more tomorrow after the race, I promise." As he jogged toward the garage, Mrs. Clark called after him, "Good luck in qualifying." Louis turned and grinned. "Don't need luck, Mrs. Clark. I've got mathematics on my side now." She watched him disappear into the busy garage, his laughter lingering in the air. Mrs. Clark stood there, holding her team shirt with the number 44, wondering what Louis had been about to tell her. What secret he had kept all these years. About that fateful day in her classroom, Angela appeared beside her. "How did it go?" "Surprisingly well," Mrs. Clark replied, still staring at the garage entrance. "He was very kind." "That's Louis," Angela said with a smile. "Come on. Qualifying. Starts soon. I'll show you to your seat." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Mrs. Clark watched from the Mercedes guest area as Louis secured pole position for the race, the crowd erupting in cheers when his time flashed on the big screens. After qualifying, she caught only a glimpse of him surrounded by media and team personnel. That evening in her hotel room, Mrs. Clark called her daughter. "Mom, where are you?" her daughter asked, concerned. "Thomas and Emma wanted to watch the qualifying with you." Mrs. Clark took a deep breath. "I'm at Silverstone." "At Silverstone? The racetrack?" Her daughter sounded shocked. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me." Mrs. Clark paused. "I'm here as Lewis Hamilton's guest." There was silence on the line, then laughter. "Very funny, Mom. Now really, where are you?" Mrs. Clark sighed and held her phone up to take a selfie, making sure the Mercedes team shirt and paddock pass were visible. She sent the photo to her daughter. Seconds later, her phone rang again. "Mom, how? What? When? How did this happen?" Mrs. Clark explained about her letter and Louis's invitation, though she left out the details about their history. Some stories weren't ready to be shared yet. "Why didn't you tell us?" her daughter asked, still sounding stunned. "We could have come with you." "This was something I needed to do alone," Mrs. Clark replied. "It's complicated." The next morning, race day, Mrs. Clark woke early and dressed carefully in the Mercedes team shirt with the number 44. As instructed, she arrived at the circuit 3 hours before the race. The atmosphere was electric, with thousands of fans. Streaming in, many wearing Lewis Hamilton merchandise. Angela met her at the entrance and escorted her through security. "Lewis asked if you'd like to see how he prepares for a race," she said. "It's quite private. He doesn't usually invite guests." Mrs. Clark nodded, touched by the gesture. "I'd be honored." They walked to the Mercedes motorhome, a multi-story structure in the paddock that served as the team's headquarters during race weekends. Inside, it was surprisingly quiet and calm compared to the frenzy outside. Angela led her to a small room where Lewis sat alone, eyes closed, listening to music. Through headphones, he wore his race suit, pulled down to his waist with a white t-shirt on top. When he opened his eyes and saw Mrs. Clark, he smiled and removed his headphones. "Mrs. Clark, good morning. Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," she admitted. "The hotel was lovely, thank you." Lewis gestured to a chair. "I'm just doing my pre-race meditation. It helps me focus." Mrs. Clark sat down, fascinated by this glimpse into his routine. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not," Lewis assured her. "I wanted you to see this part. The calm before the storm." He glanced at Angela, who nodded and left the room, closing the door behind her. For a few minutes, they sat in comfortable silence. Then Lewis said, "There's something I've been wanting to ask you. Do you remember what you taught the day we had that conversation?" "The math lesson?" Mrs. Clark thought back, surprised by the question. "It was fractions, I believe." "Why?" Lewis smiled. "Because that's when it clicked for me. Not in class, but later. When my dad explained how fractions relate to racing lines, how the shortest distance around a corner isn't always the fastest because of momentum and grip, how breaking points can be calculated as fractions of a straight." He leaned forward. "I wasn't good at math the way you taught it, with worksheets and textbooks, but I found my own way to understand it through racing." Mrs. Clark felt a wave of understanding. "You were learning differently." "Exactly. I needed to see the application, the purpose." Lewis pulled his race suit up over his shoulders. "That's what I was going to tell you yesterday. After our conversation, I went home frustrated but determined. My dad showed me how to use math in racing, and suddenly it all made sense. Those math skills helped me become a better driver." He stood up, zipping his suit. "So, in a weird way, you pushed me toward the very thing that would help my racing career. Just not in the way either of us expected." Before Mrs. Clark could respond, there was a knock on the door. "10 minutes, Lewis," called a voice. "I have to go," Lewis said. "Will you watch from the garage? You'll see things differently from there." Mrs. Clark nodded, still processing his words. "Good luck, Lewis." He grinned. "Still don't need luck. But thank you." The race was thrilling and terrifying to watch from the Mercedes garage. Mrs. Clark stood with Angela, wearing a headset that allowed her to hear the team radio. The atmosphere was tense, focused, nothing like watching on television. When Lewis battled with Max Verstappen in the opening laps, their cars touching at the high speed, Copse corner, sending Verstappen spinning into the barriers, Mrs. Clark gasped along with everyone else. The race was red-flagged while the barrier was repaired. During the delay, the team was in turmoil, dealing with the stewards who were investigating the incident. Lewis received a 10-second penalty, which he served during his pit stop. "He'll never make up that time," Mrs. Clark said to Angela, worried. Angela just smiled. "Watch him." Sure enough, Lewis began a remarkable comeback drive, overtaking car after car. Mrs. Clark found herself cheering with each pass, her teacher's reserve completely forgotten. When Lewis caught and passed Charles Leclerc's Ferrari, with just 2 laps remaining to take the lead, the garage erupted in celebration. As Lewis crossed the finish line to win, Mrs. Clark felt tears on her cheeks. The boy who once couldn't focus on fractions had just delivered a masterclass in racing, overcoming a penalty that would have defeated most drivers. After the podium ceremony, Lewis came to find her in the team's celebration area. Still in his race suit, champagne-soaked and exhausted, he gave her a quick hug. "What did you think?" he asked, eyes bright with victory. "Magnificent," Mrs. Clark said honestly. "I'm so proud of you, Lewis, not just for winning, but for who you've become." Lewis's expression grew serious. "I want to show you something." He led her through the garage to a quiet corner, then pulled out a folded piece of paper from a compartment in his race suit. Mrs. Clark recognized it immediately, his failed math test from 1998, with her red marks and comments. "I keep this, with me for every race," Lewis said softly. "Right next to my heart." Mrs. Clark stared at the paper, then at Lewis. "Why?" "Because when I got that test back, I wrote something on the back that changed everything for me." He turned the paper over. On the back, in a child's handwriting, were the words, "I will be a Formula One driver, no matter what." "I have never shown this to anyone," Lewis continued. "Not even my dad. But I wanted you to see it today." Mrs. Clark could barely speak through her tears. "I was so wrong about you, Lewis. So wrong." "We all need people who believe in us," Lewis said, echoing his words from yesterday. "But sometimes, we also need people who don't, to show them what's possible." As they walked back to the paddock together, Mrs. Clark wearing his number 44, Lewis Hamilton, the boy from Stevenage who defied all odds, by her side, she felt a circle closing that had been open for 23 years. The post-race activities were a whirlwind. Lewis was pulled away for media obligations, team debriefs, and celebrations. Mrs. Clark found herself guided to the Mercedes hospitality area, where she watched the coverage on television screens while team members and guests congratulated each other on the victory. "You must be very special," said a tall man with a German accent sitting down beside her. "Lewis doesn't invite many personal guests to the garage." Mrs. Clark turned to find Toto Wolff, the Mercedes team principal, offering her a glass of champagne. "I'm not sure special is the right word," she replied, accepting the drink. "I'm part of a very old story." "Lewis mentioned you were his teacher," Toto said. "He speaks very highly of you." Mrs. Clark almost choked on her champagne. "Does he?" He said you taught him an important lesson about proving people wrong." Toto smiled. "Something we value highly at Mercedes. We've had our own doubters over the years." Before Mrs. Clark could respond, she saw Lewis approaching, now changed into team clothes, his hair damp from a shower. He was surrounded by people, wanting his attention, but he made his way directly to her. "Sorry about that," he said. "The media always wants a piece of you after a home win." He nodded respectfully to Toto. "I see you've met the boss." "We were just getting acquainted," Toto said, standing. "I'll leave you two to catch up. Congratulations again, Lewis. Brilliant drive today." With a final smile at Mrs. Clark, he moved, away to speak with other guests. Lewis sat down beside Mrs. Clark. "So, what did you think of your first Formula One experience?" "Overwhelming," she admitted. "Nothing like watching on television. So much noise, so much tension. And that was just in our garage," Lewis laughed. "Imagine how it feels in the car." For a while, they chatted about the race, the start, the incident with Verstappen, the comeback drive. Lewis explained his strategy in simple terms, showing her data on his phone. Mrs. Clark was struck by how technically knowledgeable he was, how deeply he understood the mathematics and physics of his sport. "You know," she said suddenly, You would have made an excellent math teacher. Lewis laughed. I'm not sure my students would agree, but I do enjoy explaining things to young drivers, mentoring the next generation. You're doing that now? Mentoring? Lewis nodded. I started a commission to increase diversity in motorsport, working with teams and schools to create opportunities for kids who might not otherwise get a chance. Mrs. Clark felt a rush of pride that had nothing to do with his racing achievements. That's wonderful, Lewis. It feels like the right thing to do, he said simply. My path was difficult, but I had support. My dad, Ron Dennis at McLaren, lots of people who believed in me. He smiled slightly. And some who didn't, which was its own kind of motivation. A comfortable silence fell between them. Around them, the hospitality area buzzed with conversation and celebration. But they sat in their own quiet bubble. Finally, Lewis said, I want to ask you something, Mrs. Clark. Please, call me Verity. Verity. Lewis nodded. Would you consider being part of my commission? We need educators who understand how to reach young people, especially those who learn differently, like I did. Mrs. Clark stared at him, stunned. Me? But I'm the one who discouraged you. Exactly, Lewis said, his expression serious. Who better to help identify potential in unexpected places? You've learned what I learned. That determination matters, more than traditional talent, that kids who struggle in conventional settings might excel elsewhere. I don't know what to say, Mrs. Clark stammered. Say yes, Lewis encouraged. We meet quarterly. Nothing too demanding for someone in retirement. Mrs. Clark took a deep breath. Yes, I would be honored. Lewis smiled, pleased. Excellent. My team will be in touch with details. He checked his watch. I'm afraid I need to go soon. One last media commitment before I can really celebrate. They stood, and Mrs. Clark sensed their time together was coming to an end. Lewis, before you go, thank you. Not just for today, but for proving me wrong all those years ago. You've taught me more than I ever taught you. Lewis looked at her thoughtfully. You know, I've been thinking about our conversation in your classroom. When you told me boys from Stevenage don't become Formula One drivers, Mrs. Clark winced slightly. Not my finest teaching moment. Maybe not, Lewis agreed. But you were right about one thing. It was 1 in a million odds. Being told that made me realize I'd have to work harder than anyone else, be more determined, more focused. In a weird way, your doubts helped prepare me for the challenges ahead. He gestured around at the Formula One paddock. This world isn't fair or easy. I faced plenty of people who didn't want me here because of my background, my color, where I came from. Knowing that early, being prepared for it, maybe that was a gift. Mrs. Clark hadn't thought of it that way before. Still, I wish I'd been more encouraging. We can't change the past, Lewis said, but we can learn from it. That's what my commission is all about, making sure future generations have more support and fewer barriers. As Lewis was called away for his final interview, he gave Mrs. Clark a warm hug. Keep the shirt, he said with a grin. It suits you. Mrs. Clark watched him walk away, surrounded by team members and security. Sir Lewis Hamilton, 7-time world champion, Knight of the Realm, global icon, still wearing the number 44 from his karting days. As she left Silverstone that evening, she pulled out her phone to call her daughter with the incredible story of her day. But before dialing, she paused, remembering something Lewis had said just before being called away. There's one more thing I've never told anyone, he had whispered. Remember my notebook with 44 on the cover? There was a reason I chose that. Number for my cart, beyond it, just being lucky. What was the reason? Mrs. Clark had asked. Louis had smiled mysteriously. 4 plus 4 equals 8. And 8. He'd been interrupted then, pulled away before finishing. Now, sitting in her car, Mrs. Clark suddenly understood. In 1998, she had taught the class that 8 laid on its side forms the infinity symbol. Louis had chosen 44 because it represented infinite possibilities. All these years, he had carried that symbol with him, on his notebooks, his carts, his Formula One cars, not just as a lucky number, but as a personal reminder that with enough belief, the possibilities were endless. Mrs. Clark smiled as she started her car. The boy who couldn't focus on fractions had become a man who understood that some equations transcend mathematics, like the sum of determination and opportunity, multiplied by belief, equaling the infinite potential of a human spirit. I hope you enjoyed this emotional journey of doubt, determination, and redemption. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to know which corner of the world this story reached. If you enjoyed this narrative, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Don't forget to share with friends and family who might need a reminder that determination can overcome doubt, and that sometimes our greatest motivation comes from those who said we couldn't. By sharing this story, you're helping spread kindness and awareness about the power of believing in yourself, even when others don't. Sometimes the people who say you can't are the ones who push us to prove that we absolutely can. Until next time, keep dreaming, keep believing, and remember that with enough determination, the possibilities are infinite.